Hello, my name is Alex Chavarot with Climate Finance 2050, and I've had the pleasure of being the lead author of the finance chapter of CDRI's 2025 Global Infrastructure Resilience Report. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to present to you some of the key findings and messages of this finance chapter. The presentation will be structured along 5 components. First, we're going to look at the urgent case for resilient infrastructure investment, the funding needs that are required, and the current flows that exist. Second, we're going to highlight what we call the 3 pillars of disaster risk management finance, both pre- and post-disaster. Third, we're going to spend time looking at the key challenges that exist to scale resilient infrastructure finance, both from a government perspective as well as a private sector viewpoint. Fourth, we're going to present to you an innovative concept called Infrastructure Financial Resilience Framework, which we hope can help government officials and infrastructure agencies in managing the financial resilience of infrastructure. And last, we're going to summarize some of the recommendations that have been made in this report. First point to note is the cost of inaction. In other words, the urgency of resilient infrastructure investment. Many of you will know that disasters have a disproportionate economic damage on growing economies and make them vulnerable, even more vulnerable to climate change. In the least developing countries, for example, 70% of worldwide death caused by climate-related disasters in the past 50 years have been experienced in LDCs. The issue is that disruption from disasters not only lead to asset destructions and productivity losses, but also crowds out development budgets and therefore results in higher public debt and borrowing costs. So disasters have multiple impacts on national economies. They have direct impacts, obviously, on broken infrastructure, social impacts. They also have fiscal impacts, and they reduce the development pace of countries. What are we talking about in terms of a finance gap? Well, various studies have shown funding needs of close to $7 trillion per year throughout this current decade to achieve SDGs in terms of funding for new infrastructure. In terms of making existing infrastructure more resilient, that amount is about 2.9 trillion in low and middle income countries. So these are the numbers that one should keep in mind because they're very significant. And in terms of existing investments in new infrastructure, the gap is about 50% as compared to that $6.9 trillion per year. In terms of adaptation and disaster risk management finance, the numbers are much smaller. The 2023 figure stood at $65 billion for all adaptation efforts in emerging markets and developing economies. And of that, only 6.3 billion was mobilized for disaster risk management. There are a number of challenges, as we will see, but one of the key issues to bear in mind is the need to shift the paradigm from a focus on post-disaster response and recovery to reducing the vulnerability of infrastructure assets through investment in adaptation and pre-disaster capital mobilization. these losses have compounding effects. The infrastructure damage not only has physical implications, but it also obviously disrupt servers, and that has implications for the wider ecosystem and the economy as a whole. There is therefore a multiplier effect in that typically impacts on infrastructure can have a 10 times multiplier on the population and the reduction in wealth creation and development activity. When we look at infrastructure resilience finance, we like, as part of this report, to focus on three key pillars. The first one is the so-called capacity to absorb, and that is pre-disaster. It relates to funding retrofits, maintenance, and early warning systems. The second, happening just after a disaster, relates to capacity to respond, and that's about the rapid funding mobilization and emergency response. And then thirdly, the capacity to recover relates to the reconstruction effort and the objective of building back better. Now, the graph on the right tries to capture the so-called resilience dividend that CDRI has identified. And you can see that if you have a lower impact of a disaster through a strengthening of the capacity to absorb, the downtime and the losses will be reduced. Second, if you have a stronger capacity to respond, the direct impact of a disaster and the time it will take to respond will be reduced. And third, if you have a stronger capacity to recover, you can see that the reconstruction effort will happen more quickly and perhaps also deliver better returns. So the difference in terms of improvements around these three capacities essentially creates the portion of the graph in white here, which compares what countries and infrastructure agencies should aim for versus what would happen in a do-nothing or business-as-usual scenario. And so the difference really is what we call the resilience dividend. The question now is, how does one capture it? And importantly, how does one finance the different elements that helped create it? The answer to this is multifold. There isn't a silver bullet. Strengthening each of the three capacities requires different instruments and timelines. And that is what we call a layered approach to putting in place a strong infrastructure financial resilience framework. And the layered approach covers the three capacities of absorb, respond, recover that we mentioned earlier, and different instruments that correspond to high frequency, low severity events versus low frequency and high severity events. And so you can see that a lot of the so-called instruments relate to budgetary funding sources, as well as maintenance funds, emergency disaster funds, and budget reallocations. As they become less frequent and potentially more severe in terms of impact, that's when you start looking into insurance product, including traditional property insurance, but also parametric insurance, as well as credit lines that can be drawn upon certain events occurring. That is the schematic of what we would suggest that government officials and managers of infrastructure agencies around the world take into account when they look at the funding of resilience. So let's look in more details at each of the three capacities and the related instruments that exist, as well as a few case studies. In terms of capacity to absorb, as highlighted, the funding requirements relate to maintenance and retrofits. And there are various studies that show the benefits of investing in maintenance, and in some ways being more effective than investing in new investments, in new projects. There are various sources of funding for this, apart from maintenance funds that can be set aside for various sectors or various assets. There are indeed budgetary funds that can be allocated to this, and they can potentially be funded through resilience or green bonds. Various public sector entities, governments, development finance institutions have indeed raised such bonds with the use of proceeds earmarked to fund maintenance and retrofit, as well as early warning systems. The Indian National Hydroelectric Power Corporation is a good example of an entity having identified the benefits of implementing and investing in early warning systems at a relatively low cost, which then creates a mapping of different potential risk exposure, which is then centralized and managed to make sure that upon a disaster occurring, sufficient responses and capabilities are mobilized in a rapid manner. So that's the capacity to absorb in terms of pre-disaster risk reduction. We'll come back to that in relation to vulnerability reduction and some of the challenges in quantifying these. In terms of capacity to respond during a disaster, the key here is the speed of financial mobilization, as is the speed of response on the ground. So this can be achieved through pre-arranged financings, though it is difficult often for low-income countries to mobilize such financings. Another instrument relates to what's called the Catastrophe Deferred Drawdown Options, or CATS DDOs, which account for half of all pre-arranged financings globally. And the funds are contingent funds, and they're tied to various adaptation and resilience programs being put in place by the country that is the recipient of the funds. This is often a World Bank policy, which has worked very well in certain countries. And then obviously you've got insurance policies, both general and parametric, which complement public sector contingent capital and international aid during response phase. The issue with some of these policies, particularly the general one, is that they may take a bit of time to be mobilized. Parametric insurance, on the other hand, is much faster to be deployed. We show in the report a case study relating to Vietnam and its decentralized budget management process, whereby the state budget funds certain disaster prevention costs and then allows subnational entities to manage the deployment of these responses programs, and with local contingency budgets being made available. And that has proven to be a very effective way of responding to disasters. We then move to the capacity to recover post-disaster. Again, there are a number of funding sources to address these. The objective being to build back better. And so the issue here is to reallocate capital from budget lines is to draw on contingent funding, including credit lines, but also to use insurance pools that often exist at the regional level to then reduce the premium that an individual country would have to pay pre-disaster, but then also benefit from a larger pool of insurance post-disaster. And then there are other sources of funding linked to capital markets, including so-called catastrophe bonds, cat bonds, whereby a bond is issued pre-disaster to a large number of institutional investors who benefit from a coupon paid by the country that has issued the bonds, and would then have to disperse a pre-agreed amount of capital should a disaster occur. And so that has also proven quite effective in mobilizing large sums of capital to fund the recovery. We note several examples of regional risk pools in the report. One of the most famous being the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, which now includes 19 Caribbean governments and a number of Central American governments as well, various utilities from the region, and covers an ever-increasing list of risks, and has been quite effective in terms of paying out post-disaster to help rehabilitate and reconstruct the affected countries. More on this in the report if you're interested. The next section of our chapter looks at the key challenges to scale resilience finance. And so here, as I alluded to earlier, the strengthening of financial resilience for infrastructure requires moving beyond reactive disaster funding towards a comprehensive framework that prioritizes risk reduction, ensures rapid response capacity, and enables sustainable recovery. In other words, a paradigm shift. Now, what could it look like? Well, first of all, let's acknowledge that governments face a number of challenges when scaling resilience finance. First one is to determine how much to allocate or invest in disaster risk reduction versus putting contingent capital aside for post-disaster risk funding. And it's not an easy issue to address. The second challenge is the establishment of guidelines and standards that define resilience targets and indeed measure resilience performance and include policy that monetize resilience benefits. So that requires a vision as to how resilient certain infrastructure sectors should be over what period of time, and knowing that this is an ongoing process that needs to be reassessed on a regular basis. Third, it's about implementing regulatory and contractual framework such that both private sector capital and public sources of funding can be used to address these objectives. So what can be done to address such challenges? We've identified 4 parallel activities. The first one is to define and implement resilience standards. The second is to implement a risk allocation framework, which is largely covering public-private partnerships to take into account disaster risk management and promote the collaboration between the public and private sectors. The third is to implement frameworks and policies that quantify, allocate, and monetize the benefits of resilience. And then the fourth is for governments to fund relevant interventions to reduce infrastructure vulnerability and mobilize post-disaster finance, both from domestic and international sources of capital. If we focus on resilience standards first, I think it's important to recognize that they both establish baseline engineering and process-based targets. The higher the resilience standard, the more financial resources will be required to achieve it, but the lower the need for contingent funding for repairs or constructions. So again, it's a balance. Such standards should be embedded in the recovery phase to build back better. And indeed, there is and there should be a link between infrastructure resilience standards and the different taxonomies of resilient investment, so that capital can be channeled towards adaptation and resilience. Japan provides an interesting case study around the building safety standards, and indeed following various earthquakes, particularly some in the middle of the last century, there's been a significant improvement in the standards for building safety, and that has continued over time as risks were being reassessed and the techniques were being updated in terms of building, construction, and maintenance to withstand such earthquake risks. Many other countries are indeed now embedding resilient standards into various infrastructure sectors, and that should indeed be one of the key policies going forward. Risk allocation frameworks, on the other hand, are also very important. And they really set the scene as to who's responsible for what between the public and the private sector in the context of concessions and public-private partnerships. Regulators play a key role in defining such risk allocations, and a bankable risk allocation will then allow the mobilization of private finance. There are a number of areas that such risk allocation should cover. Obviously, the construction standards and ensuring that the asset is built to ensure resilience objectives in the first place. There can be insurance requirements that mean that the operator or the concessionaire would need to take to cover certain risks. There can be reliability standards to translate thresholds relating to the quality of the assets. There can be contingency plan to ensure funding for emergency response and business continuity. But there also needs to be some form of flexibility because, as we all know, climate change is a dynamic feature that requires regular reassessment of vulnerability and resilience targets. One point to note is the need to clarify within force majeure clause which of the different parties is responsible for what, and not simply assume that disaster risks should um, no longer be the responsibility of private sector or concessionaire, simply because they correspond to force majeure. That should only be the case to the extent that sufficient investment has been made to ensure that the asset is resilient to certain thresholds. The Brazilian Road Agency has developed an interesting set of guidelines as part of its road contracts, otherwise known as CREMA, where project developers and operators have to undertake a climate risk and resilience management plan, and be proactive in terms of implementing resilience measures, and have emergency response protocols. So that is a good example of a clear set of guidelines relating to a risk allocation framework. Now, if we then look at policies for infrastructure resilience, as mentioned, they ought to relate to the quantification, allocation, and monetization of the resilience benefits. The direct benefits are those that relate to a single asset or an infrastructure system. They may lead to incremental cash flows, reduction of downtime, and more generally, the reduction in asset vulnerability, which itself can lead to improved insurance terms. So some of these benefits ought to be quantifiable, relatively easy, and most of them can also be monetized. And so then the question is, how are they allocated between investors, operators, users, and indeed public sector? And that will be done on a case-by-case basis. The more difficult issue relates to indirect benefits, which typically relate to the reliability, improved reliability of critical infrastructure, which benefits the entire ecosystem around that infrastructure, potential reduced cleanup cost post-disaster, land value increase, and improved and enhanced access to infrastructure. And so mechanisms exist and to allocate such benefits relate to adaptation certification, fiscal incentives, and direct payments such as user fees or ecosystem payments. Again, there is a variety of aspects here to take into account and mechanisms to be defined to fit with the specific situations. The Indian National Portal is a good example of a publicly available portal that provides district-level data on climate hazards and vulnerability, and can be used by utilities to meet load requirements under various climate conditions. And then separately, another case study we found was from the African Development Bank, which has put in place some adaptation benefits mechanism to help mobilize finance for resilience. So you can see that a lot of different features exist to both help monetize and allocate the benefits of resilience. And that is key to incentivizing the public sector and to some extent the private sector in terms of reducing risk and then reaping the rewards of reduced vulnerability and improved resilience. So what do we mean by funding for resilience intervention, which is the fourth um, areas that we recommend governments look at? Um, well, that relates to budget allocation to pay for resilience, and ensuring that there is enough contingent capital, knowing that there's only so much that a country can mobilize through additional debt. And so, conversely, it also means embedding resilient features in most, if not all, of the MDBs and development finance institutions funding for new infrastructure to make them resilient in the first instance. There are various sovereign loan programs that address this. We've taken the example in the report of the IMF Resilience and Sustainability Facility that's been deployed in Jamaica, where significant funding has been mobilized to support various reforms, accelerating resilience and improve climate risk management. That complements, in some ways, some of the policies that the World Bank has been implementing and the CAT DDOs that I referred to earlier. So having described the funding requirements, having identified the ways that resilience has been funded, both in terms of disaster risk reduction and post-disaster risk finance, having identified some of the challenges that are faced by governments and infrastructure agencies, and having set out a few responses to addressing such challenges, we now come to the final part of the presentation and indeed the report by presenting what we've coined the Infrastructure Financial Resilience Framework. And this is quite novel and ought to be quite interesting for various government agencies. First, we define infrastructure financial resilience as the degree to which a country has adequate financial instruments, institutions, governance arrangements, capacities, partnerships, and funding to support the actions of infrastructure agencies, related stakeholders, and the public needed to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. Quite a comprehensive definition, but we try to ensure that we cover all aspects. This framework is then looked at through both quantitative and qualitative components, and we'll go into more details for each of them. The quantitative components really relate to both funding and existing funding sources, frameworks, as well as financial instruments that a country or an infrastructure agency has access to. So, it could be the amount of funding that has been mobilized for disaster risk reduction and disaster risk finance. It can be a comparison of the levels of vulnerability of different infrastructure sectors and relating such funding with that level of vulnerability, using some insurance metrics such as average annual losses or probable maximum losses. It could be the fiscal headroom that a country may have to borrow more to address additional funding requirements. And it can be the way that some of this funding is transferred throughout the country in terms of local agencies. The instruments both relate to national and international sources of capital, and try and include or cover the different types that we've seen in the layered approach that was presented earlier. And indeed, some of these are public sources of capital, where others will be more private. The point here is to focus on three key issues once we've analyzed these funding and financial instrument characteristics. And in the report, you will see a table with a list of ratios and financial information that is required to complete that analysis. All these information is aimed at answering these issues and questions. The first one is whether the country's level of funding for disaster risk reduction is commensurate with the vulnerability of its infrastructure sector. And here, we're trying to relate how much is being invested in disaster risk reduction versus the level of vulnerability of the infrastructure sector of this country, either as a whole or as subsectors, and get a sense as to how it compares with other countries in the same income brackets, or indeed in the same region or countries which have the same macroeconomic aspects. And that's quite important because you want to ensure that your funding for disaster risk reduction relates to a level of vulnerability which you think is acceptable. Second, it's around assessing the level of risk transfer to determine whether it is indeed appropriate, namely whether there's enough contingent capital in place to meet potential losses, or what insurers call the probable maximum loss. In other words, when you aggregate all public and private contingent capital available for a particular infrastructure sector, or aggregate as a whole, and compare that with the probable maximum loss, you therefore can identify whether there's a significant gap, and you can compare whether that gap is lower or larger than existing gaps for other countries in the same income brackets, for example. And then third, it's therefore to try and assess whether the level of residual risk, which is borne by countries, public finance, is sustainable. In other words, is the country's financial position able to cope with repeated disasters in a short period of time? What might such disaster do to its sovereign ratings, its level of public debt, and so on? So how sustainable is the current level of vulnerability to disaster risk is indeed what we're trying to assess. So very important set of questions, data, to really help ministries of finance, sector agencies to understand the relative funding of disaster risk reduction versus post-disaster risk finance mobilization. That quantitative approach should be complemented by a set of qualitative considerations relating to the institutional framework, whether there are the right relationships between key entities, Ministry of Finance, infrastructure ministries, regulators, disaster risk management agencies, local governments, and so on, civil society organizations, to cope with both disaster risk reduction and post-disaster management. Linked to this, obviously, is a set of considerations relating to governance and how funding allocations are made and how funds are being dispersed, the interagency arrangements, sort of standards that are being put in place, and again, trying to get some form of comparison between countries with the same characteristics. There's a question furthermore, of capacities, including human resources, skills, technologies, and an issue around partnerships. Partnership with international institutions, donors, banking sector, and rating agencies, and the depths of such partnerships, such that a country can draw on different resources should it need to. These qualitative considerations can be assessed through various questions. I'm not going to go into the details of each of them, but you see a list here. Is there a national agency or ministry responsible for monitoring the vulnerability of the infrastructure sector to disaster risks, for example? Do national and subnational agencies responsible for managing such risks have adequate human resources? Is the country involved in one or several international climate finance initiatives? There's many more that we highlight in the report. Where we're going with this is that both these quantitative and qualitative assessments can follow a four-stage process to help assess the strengths and weaknesses of various parameters, with a diagnosis being the first step, then prioritizing areas for improvement being the second, setting a roadmap for financial resilience being the third one, acting on it, and then tracking progress being the fourth one. And that gives you essentially an infrastructure of financial resilience roadmap, having identified gaps, having set objectives, and having put in place a monitoring process, which reinforces the financial resilience of the country's infrastructure sector. To finish, let me highlight various recommendations that were made throughout the report and re-emphasized in its conclusion. The first one relates to improving access to data and risk exposure and vulnerability, including quantifying the reduction in vulnerability, which is associated with incremental investments in resilience. That's very important. Understanding risk, quantifying vulnerability, and being able to create a link between investments in resilience and a reduction in vulnerability is a very important part of the process here, both at the asset level, but also at the aggregate level of infrastructure sector in a country. Second, defining global resilience metrics to be able to compare assets, systems, and countries' vulnerabilities to disaster risk. That is something that goes beyond a single country's responsibility, and that is an area that various organizations are working on, including the UNDRR and NCDRI, and it's going to be very important to ensure that everyone speaks the same language when it comes to resilience. Third, disseminate resilience standards for specific infrastructure sectors, and which will help to bridge knowledge gaps and being part of a larger capacity building, particularly for low and middle income countries and SIDS, is important and is one of our key recommendations. Fourth, having access to technical assistance to ensure that the most vulnerable governments and their related infrastructure agencies can mobilize funding and attract private sector capital for risks is important as well, so that these various countries and agencies know how to approach these features and implement various policies. And last, to develop a wider policy mix that integrates resilience planning in the design, planning, construction, financing, operation, and maintenance of infrastructure assets is something that countries should bear in mind to reinforce their resilience. With this, all that remains for me to do is to thank you for having followed this presentation and to invite you to read the Global Infrastructure Resilience Report of CDRI, which you'll find on their website, which will have both the entire report available, but also specific chapter working papers, including the one that I just presented on finance. Thank you very much, and goodbye.